Word meaning as the unit of verbal thinking. Let us introduce our next topic with the following question. Word meaning as the fundamental unit of verbal thinking. Before discussing it in detail, let me explain why we are now shifting our attention from Jean Piaget to Lev Vygotsky. Throughout this course, we have repeatedly emphasized one simple observation. Whenever a child uses a word, there is always something behind it. A child never produces language as a collection of empty sounds. Every word points to something in the child's mind. The question is, how should we describe that something? For Vygotsky, the answer is straightforward. What stands behind a word is its meaning. That is why we must first understand what Vygotsky means by the term word meaning before we attempt to compare his ideas with those of Piaget. Although the two scholars developed different theoretical frameworks, they were examining many of the same stages of cognitive development. Their terminology differs. Their explanations differ. But they are often describing closely related psychological processes. Vygotsky develops this argument at the beginning of his classic book, Thought and Language. Let us briefly revisit the central ideas presented there. The first question he asks is a fundamental one. If we are interested in verbal thinking, then before anything else we must understand the relationship between thought and language. How are these two connected? Looking back at the psychological theories of his time, the early decades of the 20th century, Vygotsky argues that there are three possible answers. The first possibility is that thought and language are actually the same phenomenon. Imagine two circles representing thought and language. Now imagine placing one directly on top of the other until they become a single circle. According to this view, there is no meaningful distinction between thinking and speaking. The two are essentially identical. Which school of psychology would defend such a position? Vygotsky points to classical behaviorism, particularly the work of John B. Watson. From the behaviorist perspective, thinking is reduced to speech. Strictly speaking, behaviorists did not deny that people think. Rather, they argued that inner thought is not a proper subject for scientific investigation because it cannot be directly observed. Science, they insisted, should focus only on measurable behavior. If we cannot observe thought itself, what can we study? We can study speech behavior. According to Watson, what we call thinking is simply speech that has become extremely quiet. Sometimes it may take the form of whispered speech. Sometimes it may be almost completely silent, but it remains a kind of speech activity that differs only in degree, not in kind. Vygotsky found this idea both interesting and limited. It attempts to explain thought entirely in terms of observable verbal behavior. Now consider a second possibility. Instead of treating thought and language as identical, imagine separating the two circles completely. In this model, thinking and language are independent processes. At first glance, this seems like a surprising position. Which psychological tradition would support it? According to Vygotsky, this was the position of the Würzburg School, one of the earliest experimental schools devoted to the study of thinking. Whether that interpretation is entirely fair is open to discussion. Nevertheless, this is how Vygotsky presents their work. Researchers in the Würzburg tradition asked participants to solve relatively simple cognitive tasks, and then describe, through introspection, what had occurred in their minds. From these reports, they concluded that people sometimes experience what they called pure thought. They described experiences such as a feeling of a question, a feeling of doubt, or a sense of the task itself. These mental states, they argued, could exist independently of both visual imagery and language. In other words, thought does not necessarily depend on mental pictures, nor does it depend on words. A thought may exist before it has been expressed in language. It does not require verbal form in order to exist. That is the interpretation Vygotsky challenges before introducing his own theory. Vygotsky believed that both of these positions captured part of the truth, but neither explained the full relationship between thought and language. He proposed a third possibility. Imagine two circles that overlap only partially. Some forms of thinking exist without language. Some forms of language exist without thinking. But there is also a region where the two intersect. That shared region is what Vygotsky called verbal thinking. Let us begin with the first area, thought without language. Vygotsky offers several examples. One is the practical intelligence demonstrated by Wolfgang Kohler's chimpanzees. Long before language enters the picture, animals are capable of solving practical problems. They can combine objects, use simple tools, and discover effective solutions through action. More generally, this is what Vygotsky refers to as pre-verbal thought. If we connect his theory with Piaget's work, we find a familiar example. Piaget's sensory-motor intelligence belongs to this category as well. A young child can solve practical problems before language has become a central tool of thinking. Thought, therefore, can exist prior to speech. Now consider the opposite case. Can language exist without thinking? Vygotsky argues that it can. There is a form of communication that carries emotion or signals without involving conceptual thought. We do not need to look for unusual examples. The animal world provides them naturally. Animals communicate. They warn one another of danger. They express fear, aggression, attraction, or distress. These signals serve important functions, yet they are not verbal thought. They are better described as signal communication or affective communication. Human infants display similar forms of expression long before they acquire language. A cry, a laugh, a scream, an emotional vocalization. These behaviors communicate something meaningful, but they are not yet based on concepts or symbolic language. In modern terms, we would probably describe them as non-verbal communication rather than genuine speech. Neither of these two regions, however, is Vygotsky's primary concern. His real interest lies in the area where thought and language overlap. This is the domain of verbal thinking. At this point, Vygotsky turns to an important disagreement with the Würzburg School. Why does he reject their claim that thought simply exists first and is later expressed in words? His answer is remarkably concise. Because he is thinking about creative thought. The Würzburg psychologists argued that a completed thought merely appears in speech. Language, in their view, functions as a vehicle for expressing an idea that already exists. Vygotsky disagrees. He famously writes, "Thought is not merely expressed in words, it comes into existence through them." This statement should not be taken literally in every situation. It is best understood as a description of the creative process. There are moments when we have only a vague intuition. We sense that an idea is there, but we cannot yet define it. We struggle to explain it. We search for the right words, and then, quite suddenly, we find the expression we were looking for. At that very moment, the thought itself becomes clear. Vygotsky would say that before finding those words, we had not fully understood the idea ourselves. The process of putting an idea into language is not simply a matter of communication. It is part of the process of thinking. Sometimes we do not first think and then speak. Sometimes we discover what we think by speaking. That is the central insight behind Vygotsky's concept of verbal thinking. This brings us to one of Vygotsky's central concepts. If verbal thinking occupies the intersection between thought and language, Then what is its smallest meaningful unit? Vygotsky's answer is precise. The basic unit of verbal thinking is the inner side of the word, its meaning. In other words, what matters is not the sound of a word or its written form. What matters is the psychological meaning carried by that word. That meaning connects language with thought. It serves as the bridge between the two. One might ask why Vygotsky does not simply use the term concept. After all, concepts are also units of thinking. The answer lies in the subject he was studying. Vygotsky was interested in the development of children's thinking. At this stage of development, children do not yet possess fully formed concepts in the adult sense. Using the word concept would therefore suggest a level of cognitive development that has not yet been reached. Could he have chosen another term? For example, meaning versus sense? He could have. In fact, later in his work he carefully distinguishes between the two. He argues that a word's meaning and its sense are not identical. But at this stage of development, that distinction is not yet important. For young children, the two largely coincide. That is why Vygotsky consistently speaks of word meaning. He then offers a concise definition. Every word, he argues, represents a generalization. This is true even before a child develops mature concepts. Whenever we use a word, we are grouping together different experiences under a common category. That act of grouping is already a form of generalization. And generalization is one of the defining characteristics of thinking. The argument does not stop there. A word also serves another function. It allows us to communicate with other people. It makes shared understanding possible. So a word belongs to both domains at the same time. It is a unit of thinking because it generalizes. It is a unit of language because it communicates. For that reason, Vygotsky concludes that word meaning is the unity of generalization and communication. It is not simply a linguistic phenomenon, nor is it merely a cognitive one. It is the point where language and thought become inseparable. This unity, however, is not fixed. It develops over time. Like Piaget, Vygotsky is fundamentally a developmental psychologist. He is interested not only in what the mind is, but also in how it changes. As children's thinking becomes more sophisticated, their ability to communicate also becomes more sophisticated. At the same time, richer communication creates new opportunities for increasingly complex forms of thinking. The relationship works in both directions. To develop new ways of thinking, we must communicate. And to communicate at a more advanced level, we must develop more refined forms of thought. Language supports the growth of thinking. Thinking supports the growth of language. Neither develops in isolation. Each continually transforms the other. That mutual development lies at the heart of Vygotsky's theory of verbal thinking. Vygotsky now asks a new question. If word meaning develops throughout childhood, what does the meaning of a word look like in the earliest stages of development? To answer it, he makes an important observation. The development of thinking and the development of language do not follow the same direction. They move toward one another from opposite starting points. Let us begin with thinking. Vygotsky describes its development as a movement from the general toward the particular. A more accurate way to put it would be this. Thinking develops from a global, undifferentiated understanding to a more differentiated one. When a child first encounters an object or a situation, the experience is holistic. The child perceives it as a whole rather than as a collection of distinct features. Only later does the child begin to separate details, recognize relationships, and distinguish one characteristic from another. In other words, cognitive development proceeds from the global to the differentiated. Language develops differently. Here, the movement goes from the particular toward the general. At first, children learn isolated words, individual names, simple labels, single expressions. Only gradually do they begin to combine those words into phrases and complete sentences. Language grows by building increasingly complex structures from simpler elements. So we arrive at an interesting contrast. Thinking moves from the whole toward the parts. Language moves from the parts toward increasingly organized wholes. If both processes are developing simultaneously, there must be an early stage where a child knows individual words. Yet each of those words still refers to an undifferentiated mental representation. Behind a single word stands an entire global experience. Vygotsky gives this early form of representation a specific name. He calls it a syncretic image or syncretic representation. The term comes from the idea of something fused together without clear internal organization. A syncretic representation is not yet analytically structured. It is an unorganized whole. Everything connected with the experience is blended together. The object itself, the child's emotional attitude toward it, the situation in which it was encountered, the people who happened to be present. Even the word associated with that experience becomes part of the same undifferentiated mental whole. At this stage, these elements have not yet been separated into distinct concepts. They exist together within a single global representation. This idea allows us to summarize the transition we have been tracing. Earlier, we discussed the movement from action to thought, with mental images serving as an intermediate stage. Now we can describe that transition more precisely. In mature thinking, the basic units are concepts. But before concepts emerge, children rely on these syncretic formations. If we compare Vygotsky with Piaget, we might cautiously draw a parallel. Piaget describes how intelligence first develops through successful action in the physical world. From that perspective, a syncretic image can be understood as the psychological trace of successful, practical interaction with an object. It reflects experience that has not yet been organized into conceptual thought. Concepts do not appear immediately. They emerge gradually through several intermediate stages. The syncretic image represents one of the earliest forms in that developmental sequence. There is one more important comparison Vygotsky makes. In mature thinking, we speak about logical operations. These are stable, organized mental processes that allow us to compare, classify, infer, and reason systematically. Young children, however, do not yet possess fully developed logical operations. So, what comes before them? Vygotsky's answer is visual intuitions. These are not yet logical operations in the strict sense. Rather, they are early forms of reasoning that rely on immediate perception and concrete mental images. You might think of them as a child's first attempts to imitate logical thinking. Children often reach conclusions that resemble adult reasoning, but they do so without applying formal logic. Their judgments are guided by what appears obvious within the immediate situation, rather than by abstract principles. In this sense, visual intuition serves as a developmental bridge. It stands between practical action and fully developed logical thought. It is not logic itself, but neither is it simple trial-and-error behavior. It represents an intermediate stage in the growth of thinking. This leads to one final conclusion. In the earliest stages of development, a child's practical intelligence is primarily concerned with adapting to the physical world. The child learns how objects behave, how actions produce results, how to interact successfully with the surrounding environment. Piaget describes this as adaptation to reality through action. But conceptual thinking represents another kind of adaptation. Piaget himself emphasizes that higher intelligence is also a form of adaptation. Only now the adaptation is no longer directed mainly toward the physical world. Instead, it is directed toward the world of human thought and culture. A child gradually enters a system of meanings that already exists within society. This world is built from concepts, symbols, language, and shared knowledge accumulated across generations. How does the child enter that world? According to Vygotsky, the answer is through signs. Above all, through language. Language is not simply a tool for expressing thoughts that already exist. It is the cultural instrument that allows children to participate in a shared system of meaning. Through communication with adults, children gradually acquire the concepts, categories, and ways of thinking that define their culture. This process is not merely the acquisition of vocabulary, it is an entry into an entirely new form of mental life. The child moves from practical interaction with the physical environment to participation in the symbolic world of human culture. That transition is made possible through meaningful communication. And this, for Vygotsky, is why the development of thought can never be separated from the development of language.